A lot of people, when they start thinking about forest carbon management, ask the question, how does management affect forest carbon? Almost every one of those people then asks, for how long does management affect forest carbon? One of the most powerful tools we have in the ecological sciences is called a chronosequence. And that entails the installation of the same kind of management or the same disturbance repeatedly through time on, at best, adjacent stands of forests that are otherwise the same. Here at the U of M Biostation, we have what's probably one of the most studied chronosequences in forest ecology. We call them the burn plots. These are a collection of about 2-acre adjacent stands that every 20 years or so, a team of researchers manages to find a logger to come cut down all the trees, haul off the boles, and then works with either contractor or the DNR to do a prescribed burn. And that experimental treatment has been repeated all of these times going back since 1936 in order to replicate the disturbance that happened landscape-wide as recently as about 1911. So a lot of the biostation has forest land that's 1911 origin. It's about 110 years old now. And each one of these burn plots had that experimental treatment I described. And these burn plots have been put in 1936, 1948, 1954, 1980, 1998, and most recently, 2017. So we go into stands like this and measure things like the amount of carbon in above ground biomass, the amount of carbon in the soil. And we do that across stands that are 4 years old, 19 years old, 41 years old, and so on. And that's the chronosequence. So we can assemble sort of a time response function for things like above ground biomass carbon. How long does it take for biomass to come back as a function of stand age? At what point do we reach a level of standing above ground biomass that is like or approaching our old reference forests? These chronosequences are a really important tool that we're using here to understand how a type of disturbance that was regional, very common, but not representative of current management, had an impact on carbon pools. We're here in a soil pit in an old reference stand that's part of our forest carbon chronosequence. This is one of 3 reference stands that we study to gain some idea of the carbon stocks and distribution, the composition, other aspects of forest land in terms of what might be possible in later successional stages for forests that we have today at earlier successional stages. Or another way to think of these reference stands is what might be more widespread now if not for the region-wide cutting and burning disturbances that happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In terms of thinking about endpoints, one important thing to notice in this soil pit, we've got old red pine here. We're getting far along into succession. This is about a 130-year-old fire origin stand. We've accumulated a considerable O-horizon in that 130 years. Since the fire that wiped out snags, surface organic matter, any standing biomass that was present at the time of stand establishment, we've developed a couple inches, close to 10 centimeters, in fact, of surface organic matter, primarily in the form of slow to decompose pine needle litter, pine twig litter, and recalcitrant ectomycorrhizal fungal tissues. Beneath that litter layer, we have the abundance of acids leaching out of the organic matter on the surface, stripping away the things that have color in this layer of sand. This is the E horizon. As in other soils around here, we have E horizons, which are zones where carbon, organic matter, iron, and aluminum oxides have been removed in acid soil solution and then deposited at depth here in the spodec horizon, the BS horizon. That's another part of this soil that responds over time, that gradually regains lost soil carbon stocks after disturbance. We see on our carbon chronosequence that harvesting really doesn't have as detectable or significant an impact on soil carbon stocks in any part of the profile. But when you add burning to that cutting as a compound disturbance, that's when you see more of a significant reduction of this deep soil carbon that is then much slower to recover than this surface organic matter. Down here at depth, this carbon has been here for, on average, centuries. This has a slow resonance time, a slow turnover time. Accordingly, it takes a long time to replace it when it gets lost due to a disturbance. That's very different from the O horizon, which mostly cycles on a years to decade residence time. We are now in the heart of our chronosequence plots. We're standing at a small two-track crossroads where we can see 4 different stand ages and disturbance histories, all from one spot. Here on my right, we have a burn plot. We have a plot that was cut and burned in 1980. So today, 41 years old, just like me, and it has grown up back to almost pure big tooth aspen on this sandy outwash plain. It was a mixed severity fire in 1980 after the trees were cut and the boles removed of about 60, 70-year-old aspen, oak, pine, mixed hardwoods, dry site hardwoods. What you can see happening here in the 1980 burn plot right now is we're entering the self-thinning stage, 40 years or so, and these aspens are, some of them are winners, some of them are losers in the sense of stand structure. And we're starting to develop some element of vertical diversity in our stand structure. Of course, right after the cutting happened and the biomass was removed, soil carbon was the dominant pool of the ecosystem in terms of carbon distribution. Over time, in our dry outwash sites, biomass represents a larger and larger share of total ecosystem carbon. And actually, for the lake states is a little exceptional in that biomass does represent more of the ecosystem carbon than soils. In the lake states, typically it's the other way around. Soils dominate regardless. But here on our outwash sands, there's just so little soil carbon that by the time you're about a century old, 80 years old, there's more carbon above the ground than below the ground. In contrast to the 1980 cut and burn, where we see a slow rate of recovery of the canopy, a slow increase in leaf area index, a slow increase in carbon flux of leaf litter fall, a slow increase in biodiversity of the tree community. We have here a 1972 cut. Our carbon chronosequence contrasts stands that originate after a cutting and burning disturbance from those that were cut only, and representative more of typical management in the lake states today. One of our findings in terms of comparing these two chronosequences differing in disturbance history is that leaf recovery, the canopy recovers more quickly from a cut-only disturbance. Leaf area index increases more abruptly, leaf litter fall carbon flux increases more abruptly, and the diversity of the tree community is greater after a cut only than after a cut and burn. So contrasted with an essentially pure big tooth aspen stand after cut and burn, I can see within just 30 yards from here 2 species of pines, red oak, paper birch, red maple, big tooth aspen. So a good illustration in one place of 2 very different trajectories of succession and carbon dynamics. The last thing I'd like to say is, despite those differences in biodiversity, canopy structure, canopy recovery, there does not appear to be any difference in the carbon accumulation of these 2 different forest communities. Biomass production is the same. It appears to be resistant to that compound disturbance of fire following a burn. Soils, on the other hand, there's a longer term recovery process at play there, and as described in the video about soil carbon recovery over successional time, there is a slower rate of recovery of soil carbon pools with that second disturbance of fire after a harvest. We're standing now in front of the 1936 burn plot. This was the first experimental plot to be installed in the burn plot's chronosequence. It was done by Professor Frank Gates, who was the first person to realize, hey, it might be a good idea to replicate this disturbance that happened everywhere across the region, or at least the landscape, from time to time through the next few decades, so we can study forests as they regrow following that cutting and burning. The things that I'd like to point out about the 1936 burn plot are the canopy of mature big-tooth aspen, in some cases dying and becoming snags, becoming transferred to that coarse woody debris carbon pool on the forest floor. Coarse woody debris is a small fraction of total ecosystem carbon. Around the time of 80 years or so, this 1936 burn plot, that's when we start to see a significant bump up in the amount of coarse woody debris as a component of total ecosystem carbon. It's still at most only 5 to 10% of ecosystem carbon at this age, but it probably plays a disproportionate role in other aspects of the ecosystem, from the soil water retention that it promotes, the habitat for small mammals that have an awful lot to do with the composition of what grows in forests as they go through succession. The thing I'd like to point out about composition here is the abundance of white pine in the understory, and in some cases even codominant with the big-tooth aspen. On this dry sandy site, we're reaching a point where that white pine is starting to replace the big-tooth aspen as it breaks up and succession proceeds. We're at a place now that is very special. It has a long history. At the biostation, we call it Indian Point. On maps through the ages, it has two names, Indian Point and Colonial Point. The difference between those names is exactly what it sounds like. A local Anishinaabe person once told me, "Oh, you're doing research at Indian farm country." And that's what this place was for a long time. At least for centuries, local Anishinaabe people practiced a patchwork of slash and burn agriculture here. They grew maize, squash, beans. When we think of farm country across a lot of the Midwest, it doesn't look like this. So the contrast in management there is a really profound one. Biostation researchers think of this as old growth. This is an example of the best case scenario of what happens when you leave a forest alone and allow it to achieve an advanced successional state. As a lot of the lands in this area were being logged off and used to rebuild cities like Chicago after the fire, the growth of Grand Rapids, the latter part of the 1800s, timber like this became very desirable. We're in a stand that has a lot of red oak, eastern hemlock, white pine, of course, was the choicest of species to the timber barons of the time. And as this was happening throughout the landscape, throughout Emmett and Sheboygan counties, there was a village of Anishinaabe people still living here. In the fall of 1900, the sheriff of Sheboygan County and a person with interest in the timber burned down the village of Anishinaabe people here. They left, being displaced, and this place was called Colonial Point. Lumbering interests did acquire the rights to this property as a result of that burnout, which is commemorated every year by relatives of people who experienced it. For many decades, this property was owned by a hardwood lumber company in Petoskey that actually didn't want the pine. They did single tree selection harvests of sugar maple. That was what was desirable for veneer, for cabinetry. Individual, very large sugar maples were cut out of here through the 40s, 50s. Past biological station researchers thoroughly studied this area, figuring out what the past land use, what the patterns of agriculture, single tree selection, how those imprinted themselves upon these few hundred acres. In the 1980s, a developer wanted to purchase this property. The biological station and a local conservancy banded together, raised funds, a lot of which came from people who live near here now, lakeshore residents who valued this as an example of beautiful old age forest land. This place was called Colonial Point Memorial Forest, and it memorialized also the life of a person who was instrumental in acquiring it. In more recent years, we at the biostation have wholeheartedly adopted the name Indian Point, which many people never cease to use, to reflect the history of this place. Today, we study in terms of carbon dynamics and succession, we study Indian Point as a representation of a late successional stage. If that logging and burning hadn't happened everywhere, if forest land on fine soils and moderate microclimates such as we have here along the edge of Big Burt Lake, this is what perhaps forests could become. One of the things that we've observed this forest become is a real mess. American beech was a significant part of the basal area of this forest until less than 10 years ago. Virtually all American beech has died due to beech bark disease, has broken off, and input a truly massive quantity of carbon to the coarse woody debris pool in this forest. Because we had been studying this area of forest land for many years before the disease became established, before the trees died, we were able to watch it move through and quantify those carbon transfers. Despite the loss of that important species, this is still a net carbon sink. This is the most significant carbon sink that we study in our forest carbon chronosequence. It has the largest carbon pools above ground in all of this wood that has grown over centuries. It has a soil with an appreciable silt and clay content, so it stores more carbon in the soil. That's one of the things that makes it not an ideal representation of most of the sites we study, which are on poor, sandy outwash, but which nonetheless make this a good reference point. Otherwise, we have nothing. We have to study these examples in some cases to look at what can carbon pools be as an upper bound, a best case scenario in the absence of management. What are carbon fluxes? This is also the strongest carbon sink on an annual basis of our chronosequence, and it's by far the oldest stand. So it goes to show that place matters, that management matters, that disturbance history matters, and appreciating those things and measuring the parts of the carbon cycle are what we need to do to inform how we manage and where we manage.